Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this webinar on the impact of in-housing on creativity and ROI. I'm Mindy Chahal, Head of Content at Digiday Media, and before we get started, I just want to give you a few details of the structure of today's session. So first of all, thank you for joining us this morning. Over the course of this webinar, we're going to be discussing some of the biggest findings from our 2020 in-house report. We've spoken to 200 CMOs in Europe to uncover the biggest benefits and barriers to in-housing. And today we're going to be talking about some of those findings from the report, but we're also going to aim to focus on creativity, transparency, and ROI in particular. So throughout this session, it would be great if you have any questions, just submit them via the GoToWebinar platform. There's a questions tab and you can just fill in your questions there. And we'll have some time at the end of the session to answer those for you. And just a reminder, everyone registered will also get a recording of this webinar by email tomorrow, should you miss anything or want to revisit any part of the conversation. Okay. So, joining me today is Bannerflow, and we've done this project in partnership with them. So a bit about them, for anyone that isn't aware already. They're a Swedish ad tech company working with over 1,000 brands in more than 30 countries. It's a creative management platform, or a CMP as it's most often called, and it empowers teams to design, scale, publish, analyze, personalize, and optimize creative inside one solution. And joining me from Bannerflow today is their Head of Insight, Antonia Lindmark. Antonia has a background within research and has worked in various different insight roles for more than 10 years in media and telecoms. Antonia, we're really excited to have you with us today. Welcome.
Thanks, Mindy. Glad to be here.
So Antonia, we'll talk a bit more in a few minutes, but before we just start the discussion, I want to give the listeners a bit more information about the in-housing research that we've been working on. This will just add some context to some of the stats and insights you're about to be privy to. So to set the scene, for a second year in a row, Digiday and Bannerflow have been looking into the biggest drivers, barriers and benefits around in-housing, as I mentioned. And when we first started looking at in-housing, it was often referenced as, more of a buzzword. There weren't that many brands open to talking about their efforts, and some of the details on what in-housing actually consists of were a bit light. So the data we can now say is showing that in-housing is actually no longer a trend or a buzzword, but it's actually a fundamental shift in the way marketers are working. And I'll just read out a few of the headlines from Digiday to give you an idea of how much it's actually grown as a topic. So one story a couple of weeks ago around the Super Bowl, why brands are using in-house agencies for Super Bowl work. And for anyone who doesn't know, Super Bowl ads are a huge deal. So the fact that they're using in-house agencies is very interesting. Another headline, we wanted to take control inside Sony Picture Entertainment's in-house strategy. And another headline, we realized we could pull it off. 2 years in, Bayer, the multinational pharma company, is on track to take all media buying in-house by 2020. So as you can see from these headlines and the research that we've done from Bannerflow that you're about to see, the majority of brands are not just thinking about in-housing anymore. It's no longer a buzzword. They're actually building on their teams and tweaking their approach and their in-house models. And they're also growing their teams and really looking at how these teams are set up for success. And again, more on that later. But first, let's give you some headlines and frame some of the discussion today. So overall this year, we found that within housing, transparency is now an expectancy. Data and creativity are becoming respected equally. And we have data that shows brands are actually achieving ROI from in-housing. And to get these findings and to build a picture of how in-house teams operate, we surveyed 200 European brands, as I mentioned earlier, but this year we also sat down and had a deeper dive with CMOs from Telenor, Getty Images and Sky, just to mention a few. Through these interviews, we're basically able to move the research over a bit to get more of a kind of understanding of experiences and get some key advice for other brands looking to in-house. And that was a great part of the project this year. Antonia, we've been doing this for, at this point, 2 years now, but what do you think the most interesting finding is from this year's report?
Well, the drivers to in-house for the majority of the respondents are this year again, transparency, cost saving, and greater agility. But a standout insight this year is that the majority have experienced an increased level of creativity as a side effect, which really shows the impact of in-housing.
Okay, brilliant. I think that creativity piece is one thing that I'd like to pick out in particular. It does make me wonder if, you know, creativity is a side effect. I wonder if that's just not an expectation from marketers when they're thinking about in-housing. Are there any misconceptions that people have regarding in-housing their marketing team?
Yeah, that you need to choose between having an in-house team or working with external agencies, because it's not either or. Many brands are being very successful blending in-house and external support.
Okay, and have you got any advice for combating some of the misconceptions around in-housing?
From what we've seen, the key is knowing what your organization can do in-house and what areas you still need to outsource and to ensure a great delivery. So it is important to spend time initially on identifying what you should in-house first. And you can start really small and then let the team grow over time as you grow in confidence as well.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's good advice. With a lot of brands that are thinking about it now, it's you know, a good thing to just take a step back and think about what parts you actually need to in-house. And that kind of feeds in nicely to a couple of key themes that we found this year that build on some of the realities of in-housing, including more about marketers' experience from those that have actually done it, different in-house models, because, you know, it's not one size fits all, why they work, and kind of that effect on creative output and return on investment. Because any kind of shift towards a different model, it has to look at, you know, what return we're getting from this. So let's look at the first theme, Antonia. So to build on what in-housing means and what it actually looks like, the research we decided to try and map out some of the following. So how people are feeling towards taking the step to in-house, what in-house teams are actually made up of, and what this means for agencies. Because brands that are in-housing some or parts of their digital marketing, it has made an impact on how they work with their agencies. I think the aim was to give brands that haven't started their in-housing process a glimpse into the world of brands that actually have been through it. So if we look at some of the experiences now, as you can see, we've got a bit of a mixed response from our CMOs. Antonia, what are we seeing here? Can you shed some light on what some of these stats mean? Some say it's a challenge but worth it, but what's your take?
Well, everyone knows that any shift to in-marketing doesn't come without its challenges, and in-housing is no different. Setting up a team can be hard, as it is a new way of working for everyone involved. So I'm actually surprised that most respondents, as you can see here, find it quite easy. But for a quarter of our respondents, it's been a struggle with many hurdles. The survey showed this year again that a lack of internal support, as well as getting internal buy-in, are perceived barriers to in-housing for many respondents. And to me, this shows that there is a need for a higher degree of experience exchange to get these in-house teams in place in a smoother way. Within some organizations, there will be, of course, a tougher job to sell in-house internally. So this is where case examples from other companies who have already in-house can come in handy and can be followed as an example.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it's that perseverance of those brands that think it's worth it, despite all the challenges they're experiencing. It's quite interesting, and we'll go through some of the drivers of in-housing later, and that should explain why some people are, you know, persevering with in-housing. But for now, let's look at some of the in-house setups. So I think when we think about experience of in-housing, it can definitely correlate with what their setup actually looks like. And a lot of the headlines that you see around in-housing refer to brands bringing some, but not all of their marketing functions in-house. And some brands have their own in-house agency, like Sky Creative, who spoke to us in the report. Antonia, talk us through some of the in-house models that we can see on the screen. What are the models that came through this year?
Of course. So like you said in the intro, there is no one-size-fits-all model. And this may be expected, but for the first time, we have been able to define and separate them. We mapped out what those structures might look like and discovered 3 different models for in-house organizations. But there are many submodels sitting underneath, so that's worth saying. But on the screen, you can see 2 different ends of what we see as the in-housing scale when it comes to structure. At one end, on the left, we have full digital competency. This is where a marketing team requires almost no regular external support. Okay, and on the other side, the right side, we have a traditional setup. And this is where teams are regularly assisted by external agencies. And then in the middle, you have the hybrid model. And this is a model frequently used by many of the big brands who have in-housed in the last 12 months, just as you mentioned as well.
Yeah, definitely. I think that hybrid model seems to be quite a common route for a lot of brands. My understanding is that brands that are using this still want support from their agencies, as bringing it fully in-house is quite a big step for many to take. It definitely puts you in charge, but there's more to manage, and there's more on your plate. Is that what hybrid refers to here?
Yeah, and I think you're right. It's about keeping a balance here between taking it all on and leaving it all to agencies. So hybrids means that these teams feel they can take on some, but not all complexities of in-housing. Agencies support these teams in specialized areas, either as a part of an internal team or as an external partner. Arla, Renault, Vodafone, Unilever, Procter & Gamble, they are all examples of brands that are blending in-house teams and agencies, experimenting with various iterations of in-house models. And if we take Procter & Gamble, for example, they began to manage part of its media, production, and creative themselves in 2018. In December last year, they announced that nearly 30% of its $7 billion global media spend is now planned in-house. So, I mean, they've done a great shift, but they are still using agencies where needed for the rest of their media spend.
Yeah, that's interesting. It also depends on the size of in-house teams, I think. So just to give you a few examples, Sky Creative, which is Sky's in-house agency, is 350 people strong. And compare that to Telenor, which has 20 people, and you've got quite a different in-house story between them. Another example is Sony Pictures Entertainment. So it's in-housing pieces of its performance media buying, and that team alone is just 14 people. But that's an in-house agency for just that particular function. So there's definitely, as we mentioned, these 3 models are on the screen are ones that came through the research this year, but there's definitely no one size. The in-house teams in the research, we also found they were quite sizable, and that will affect how much external help that brands need, right, Antonia?
Yes, absolutely. So in-house teams come, as you say, not only in different forms, but also in many different sizes. And we can see that 40% have a team of between 11 to 20 people, and 78% have a team of 6 or more. So the hybrid model actually makes a lot of sense when looking at the average team size. Quite big teams, but the workload is very broad, and they still need that specialized support for campaigns where the skills do not exist within the in-house team.
Yeah, and for the range of CMOs that we interviewed, these are actually big teams. What are they all doing? What's their function?
Yes, They are sizable, and we can also see that the workload for these teams is increasing over time. Many brands have, not surprisingly, already in-housed some of the more typical marketing roles, including social media, content, and design. But what we also seen is that many brands have started to in-house paid search and media buying. To me, this suggests that brands are growing in confidence with in-housing, as these are arguably more complex skills. And I think we also need to remember here to look at what is driving the need for in-housing and encouraging brands to take on this work for themselves. Part of the research looks at the drivers, with transparency being one of them. The majority were worried about transparency last year, and these concerns still exist this year too. So it looks like this issue won't be going away anytime soon. In our research, almost 40% of the respondents listed increased transparency as the top reason to in-house their marketing team. So the stats speak to the need for transparency for whichever kind of in-house setup that has been chosen to implement, I guess.
Yeah, and we've touched on that setup and the experience of brands, but one thing we haven't mentioned is what this all means for agencies out there. It's bound to affect how and when their services are required and how brands work with them, right?
Absolutely. The impact on agencies became very clear when researching these in-house models, together with what brands require both now and in the future. Some skills traditionally handled by agencies are now being handled by the in-house team instead, whilst at the same time new opportunities are rising for some of the agencies. We looked at the type of services that are used on a monthly, quarterly, and annual basis for brands. And interestingly, over a third, as you can see here, of the respondents are using digital transformation agencies. And these agencies typically support brands with both processes, people, and ad tech solutions. Media agencies, on the other hand, still have a trust issue to handle. Only 4% of the respondents are happy with their media agencies as it is today. 56% of brands say that transparency is still a major concern. However, what we've seen is that some progress has been made, with 40% saying that they are only somewhat concerned.
Okay. And what do agencies need to do here?
That's a fair question, I think. Most traditional agencies need to look at how they can evolve where needed in order to adapt to the in-house brands. Agencies that are willing to adjust business models and the skills they offer will definitely have an important role to play going forward. So one example of this is Vodafone. Since the summer of 2018, they have been running most of their digital media buying in-house with phenomenal results. And this has led, of course, to a new way of working with their agencies. And they now have internal teams serving 11 of its 25 markets. But they state that their agency relationships have actually never been more important, since it allows them to pull in and out the talent needed, giving them great flexibility. And I also want to bring forward another example directly from the report, in fact. We heard from Pulse, an on-site agency for News UK, who publish The Times, The Sunday Times, and The Sun. They have invested in a marketing specialist within the 75-strong team to ensure they can field all briefs. So to my point, these two examples, I think, capture perfectly how we see some agencies already approaching the new era of in-house brands.
Yeah, definitely. Antonia, thank you for going through that. Let's move on to the theme of creativity and ROI, which is always a good one. So it's been a hot topic in marketing for so many years, whether it's kind of data versus creativity or the importance of great creativity. But I think when it comes to in-housing, there's so many headlines around in-housing for transparency or, for cost reasons or efficiency. What is the link to creativity for marketers when they're in-housing?
Yeah, this is an interesting one, as our research showed it's highly relevant and linked to in-house teams and their work. So creativity has always mattered, of course, but then, yeah, as we all know, came data, which took a hold of marketeers and their ability to iterate very quickly. You could communicate to the right person at the right time, but many forgot about the right message. Now, brands are once more taking control of the creative part, also adding the right message. And from the report, we can see here that 63% have seen increased creativity after moving in-house. This is a key statistic which demonstrates the power and impact of in-housing. I touched upon the drivers for bringing operations in-house previously, but here is where the real value is added for organizations. Brands may not move in-house for increased creativity, as you say, Mindy, but they get it as an awesome side effect.
Yeah, and it is definitely a great side effect, especially if it's not, one of the key drivers. To get that as an added benefit, I think is a very positive message for any of you listening if you want to be in housing in the next year or so. But does this also mean, because they, as creativity is a side effect, does this mean that in-house teams or in-house agencies are actually setting themselves up for measurement?
Yes, there's actually a lot of brands who have put creative measurements in place. 93% have KPIs for creativity to full or at least some degree in place, which is very impressive. And of these 93%, 45% have already KPIs in place, with a further 48% experimenting with suitable KPIs. So what this suggests is that having control over the creative production actually allows brands to set creative focused KPIs. Just as there are many different in-house models, worth saying is also that there are many different ways of measuring this. Telenor, for example, is measuring creative performance by a combination of ad recall, ad liking, and campaign efficiency. And I would be super interested to hear from you in the comments on how your brand approaches measuring creative performance today. So you listening, you can do this in the GoToWebinar panel. Just enter your comment and hit enter. And also, so as you can expect, there is at the same time an emerging debate on whether creativity should be measured or not, and how exactly you do so too.
Yeah, definitely. I think that debate around creativity and measurement will always exist. And given what you've said about creativity as a side effect and those in-house teams having those creative KPIs in place, do you think that in-house teams are starting to find that balance between creativity and data?
I think they are starting to anyway. This balance will also come quite naturally as there's a link between increased ROI and creativity. We can in the research see that these two go hand in hand, which might not come as a surprise, but still as a good reminder for those who are focusing solely on data.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you for that. Let's actually look at what some of these ROI numbers are. Can you explain what we're seeing on the screen here, Antonia?
Absolutely. So 58% of marketeers are seeing positive ROI from in-housing, which is quite impressive. And as you can see on the right-hand side, only 3% report having witnessed no signs of improved ROI since moving in-house. Furthermore, 74% of those questioned who have seen an increase in ROI since in-housing also note a level of improved creativity. So again, it appears that for these brands anyway, there is a correlation between greater creativity and a positive ROI.
Okay. And I'm conscious that we kind of keep mentioning ROI, but it'd be good to go through what that actually looks like for the in-house team. What are we talking about when we're talking about return on investment?
So I just want to quickly remind us of the challenges we have previously seen with measuring return on investment in the past. Now, when we are talking about in-housing, we can see that there is access to better data and also control of that data, meaning that in-housing becomes easier to measure and report on any return of investment. And the more in-housed the brand is, the more ownership of over-performance a team will feel they have. So maybe it's not so surprising seeing a majority reporting some signs of return of investment. But coming back to your question here, Mindy, how teams choose to measure ROI will come down to the marketing activities they run, but also the strategic mission of the brand itself. It's quite hard to say that ROI would look what it would look like to every brand, and this is something that needs to be decided for themselves very early on in the process.
Okay.
For in-housing, the return centers around speed, and over a third of respondents say in-housing gives them a competitive advantage because they can react more quickly to marketing trends. In today's digital marketing world, the old rules no longer apply, as we all know. To be truly competitive, you can't afford to be slow. And technology is an important enabler here to add efficiency and control over that data.
Okay, brilliant. Antonia, thank you so much for going through some of those research findings for us. And as mentioned earlier, you will get this webinar in your inbox tomorrow should you want to go through any of those stats that you've seen on screen and any of the stats that we've spoken about over the last half an hour. But before we take some questions from listeners, can you give us one piece of practical advice that you would give someone starting out within housing?
Right. Number one piece of advice: talk to brands who have already in-house for guidance. The majority of brands have already started to build their in-house teams, so there is a lot of experience out there to absorb. Also, make sure to just get started. Start small and make it super clear what skills should be handled in-house and what skills that should not be in-house right from the start. And depending on resources, it could be a good idea to migrate functions in-house one at a time. And finally, it goes without saying, measure performance from the start, because this will help you massively when it comes to building the business case internally.
Okay, thank you. And as I mentioned earlier, we've been doing this project for 2 years, but where do you think we'll be with this in-house conversation in about 5 years' time?
That's a good question. I think by then the confidence among brands will have grown even stronger with more complex skills handled in-house, such as media buying, which we're already seeing, but to a higher degree, and artificial intelligence for digital marketing, to mention some examples. And I also believe that more agencies will by then have adjusted their business models to fit the new needs from in-house brands. And as I said, we can already see that happening with brands getting more transparency on the decision being made. Agencies are adapting to this trust issue.
Okay, brilliant. We've got some time for questions now. So please do submit these via GoToWebinar platform and the questions tab, and we'll do our best to get through them. One question that's already come in, and it comes up kind of, all the time, I think, is how do you combat the skills gap?
Yeah, right, exactly. Finding the right skills are always a challenge. By partnering with recruiters specialized in either digital marketing or specialized on supporting in-house teams, brand can better position itself to capture talents. But I think it's also very important not only looking at the skills, but making sure that it is a good fit culture-wise, because you don't want to just recruit, but also keep the talents over time. And when talents are in place, make sure to have a learning plan for everyone in the team in order to make sure that the team develops over time.
Okay, thanks. And what is the one question that comes up all the time on in-housing?
What kind of skills and talents that should be in the team from the start when you start building the team? And I guess we already touched upon it, since in-house teams look so differently depending on the organization. There is no easy answer. You need to do that initial work, identifying what your organization would benefit of doing in-house and what skills that are smoother to use external support for. But when that job is done, it will be clear what skill sets that are needed. You could also use, of course, a digital transformation agency to support in this process, giving recommendations on both where you should start, which skills and processes and tech support needed in order to manage your goals.
Okay, brilliant. And another one here. So the data says that most in-house teams are pretty big. What's your advice on making sure they're working efficiently?
Embrace an agile way of working. I mean, the key concept of agile is, of course, focusing on speed to delivery and a test, learn, iterate cycle. Also, do not underestimate the need for project management. It's easy that you just focus on the creative skills that you need for your team, but you will also need someone in the team to ensure internal alignment.
Okay, brilliant. Let's have a look at a few more. So another one that's come in is around data. So how does control over data impact the decision to take work in-house?
That's also an interesting one. I mean, we have been talking about data for so many years, but now we can actually see that the teams are starting to have control of that data for real. So when you have the data in place, you can take decisions on that are much better suited decisions based on not only gut feeling. Okay. Do you have anything to add in there, Mindy, from your experience?
Yeah, I think data, and we've had this conversation offline as well, I think data is going to be a huge driver for organizations in every field, not just through in housing. I think with the demise of third-party cookies and everything that's going on and Google's kind of 2-year deadline, I think any organization that isn't looking at how they can access and use their data in a privacy compliant way, I think needs to kind of start doing that now. So it's not just in housing. I think data will impact a lot of the ways that organizations will run in the future. Let's look at another question here that we've got in. What are the most common problems in-house advertising teams experience when working together with external agencies?
Well, from the conversations I had with brands, I think it's a question of communication in many cases. When the roles are being changed, you need to communicate these and be very clear on who does what and who is in charge of which decisions. So in those cases, when there is a very straightforward communication between the agency and the in-house team, I think we usually see good success.
Okay, great. And we've got a question here about the size and nature of the panel, and I think someone missed the beginning of the webinar, which is fine, you'll get a recording, but just to reiterate, kind of we looked at 200 CMOs based in Europe, and the panel was made up of the Digiday audience, and the survey was done in November and December last year. But again, some of these details are in the report as well, which is available to download. Let's look at another question here. So what are the activities ad agencies should focus on now in housing increases?
I think we touched upon that as well, that even if in-housing is increasing, new opportunities are also increasing. So brands are doing more on their own, but there are lots of work that they need support with. So yeah, again, making sure to understand where the gaps are, where the needs are, and how they can contribute.
Okay.
Yeah, kind of listening to their customers to understand the new needs.
Okay.
That's a good starting point. Yeah.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you for that answer. I think this next question is something that we've spoken about before, and is something that we'll probably start to look at as the research develops. But who is the best candidate to set up in-house, I guess, in-house models? Is it a digital expert, or is it, the CMO? Who's kind of responsible for setting that up?
There as well, very different depending on the organization. So in some organization there might be someone that can work with that kind of full time to get that team in place. It could be that you appoint the head of in-house and have that as a role, which is not always the case, but when you do, that person bring in the expertise that's needed. But in other organization, it's part of the digital competencies within the marketing team, or also, as we talked about, for organization, especially in a bigger organization, it could be a good idea to take help or support, external support from a digital transformation agency, in order to, since it's not only about choosing the right tech or getting the right skills in place, but it's a mixture of getting both processes, people, and tech in place in order to succeed with your in-house team.
Okay. Great. And we've got quite a few measurement questions in there, so I'll just ask kind of more of a general question here. How do in-house teams measure the success of campaigns? And I know we touched on this earlier in some of the stats, but yeah, if you could give us an answer to kind of how teams are measuring success.
Exactly, and that was the question I also reached out to the audience on, to hear more about how brands are doing it, because it differs a lot. As you say, I mentioned Telenor. That was one of the interviews in the report, how they do it. But I mean, I guess this depends on the team's output. Since the in-house teams are so different, both in size and in models and in the skills that they are handling, and the output is very different. Also, the measures becomes very different. So there is not one fit all when it comes to model, and that goes also for the measurements. But of course, we talked about their ability to react quickly to trends. That is one way of measuring as well, except the parts we talked about regarding Telenor.
Okay. Brilliant. And we've got another data question here. Do you believe that in-housing is also about brands starting to build their own data stack and look to have their own in-house resources to activate that, rather than relying on agencies to buy from Google and Facebook, as an example? And I think that's quite a big question, but what do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's kind of getting the best of both worlds, and it all comes down to the confidence within the in-house team. But as you say, big question, but yes, I would say we are seeing it happening.
Okay. Brilliant. We've got lots of questions coming in, and I'll be sure to share these with the team after, just in case we don't get to them. But we'll do a couple more, and then we'll have to answer these offline. But it's great that so many questions are coming in, and really appreciate it. So I think there's one question here about. And this is probably one that I can answer, just from looking at what's happening with in-housing and in-housing agencies. There was a question here about examples of when in-housing goes wrong. I think anyone after this webinar, if they look up what happened with Pepsi, I think that would answer that question there. But I think for now, we should probably wrap up. So thank you so much for all of these questions that have come in. And thank you, Antonia, for answering those on the spot.
Thank you, Mindy.
So let's just close it there. And you know, the insight looking into these stats has been so great. Antonia, thank you again for doing that. So on the screen, you'll see Antonia's details. Should you want any more info on Bannerflow or the in-housing project, feel free to contact her or myself at Digiday. And I'd like to thank everyone for listening and joining this morning and submitting all those questions. As a reminder, you'll receive a recording of this session in your inbox tomorrow for you to share with your colleagues and re-listen on demand. So thanks again and have a great rest of the day.